Hello friends, and welcome to a new episode of Reality Check. Our age is dominated by the ephemeral and the transient. Cultural deconstruction runs rampant, and the looming nihilism seems to engulf all meaning and existence itself. Yet, the transcendence still manages to break through. Here at Reality Check, we inquire how to conserve the real in a time of deconstruction. Well, part of our daily reality, of all of us, if we want it or not, is politics. So in today's episode, I want to inquire about the reality of politics and how politics can be based on reality. On the intricate tapestry of contemporary political discourse, the Catholic Church and its philosophical adherents, Catholic philosophers, find themselves navigating a labyrinth of challenges that test the very foundations of their belief. The terrain is fraught with ideological tensions, placing the Catholic political philosopher in a precarious position, akin to Odysseus sailing between the mythical monsters Scylla and Charybdis. On the one side lies the allure of liberalism, with its emphasis on individual liberties and pluralistic values, tempting the faithful to navigate the waters of secular governance. On the opposing shore stands the formidable fortress of integralism, beckoning towards what critics would call a more authoritarian or even theocratic vision. As the Church contends with the pluralistic demands of contemporary society, profound questions arise. How much common ground can a Catholic philosopher share with liberalism? What defines Catholic politics in an era marked by profound socio-political changes? And does the Catholic political philosopher risk being castigated as a proponent of theocracy, ensnared by adversaries quick to raise the alarm? I think fewer can answer these questions better than the guest that I have invited today, Dr. David Schindler. He wrote many a book on these topics, and I'm very glad to have him on the show. So welcome, Dr. Schindler.
Well, thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
Now, it is funny because you wrote a book whose title could be not better suited to this podcast. It's called The Politics of the Real. And I wanted to really start with that, politics and reality, something very basic. Why did you call your book that? And what does politics have to do with reality and vice versa?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and something I spent a lot of time thinking about a title for the book because the book is written in a theological context, but I wanted to make it very clear from the outset that it's not a book about religion. It's a book really about politics and about the inner meaning and the substance of politics. Though I think the theological context becomes really crucial for that. So politics of the real. It's a call to reorient our political discourse, our political thinking around reality. Now, I mean, in a way, there's nothing more traditional. The classical politics was about the res publica, the public thing, the public reality that by which was generally meant the reality of the community that concerns the whole people, all of us together, to organize a community to live in that genuinely promises human flourishing. But I think so that there's a classical meaning. I think it becomes especially interesting when in against the background of that sort of classical meaning. One recognizes that so many of the disastrous political experiments have taken place on the basis of ideology of some sort, on the basis of a utopian vision, an abstraction as an ideal by which everything else is measured. And the problem is there an abstraction precisely as such has no tethering. Nothing to connect it, nothing to guide it, nothing to give it sort of context and meaning, and I think that's one of the reasons it can be so violent and destructive. So I wanted to recall reality at the center of politics, but as I try to make clear in the book, this isn't like a realpolitik. Typically, when we talk about reality in politics, we mean we need to take a very sort of pragmatic turn. That's a kind of the modern interpretation. I wanted to recover a sense of reality, but give it a robust reading that one finds in, drawing on the resources of the classical tradition. The good, the true, and the beautiful are essential to the meaning of reality, and that ought to be the reference point in our political thinking.
Very, very good. I find that when you have a political discourse, oftentimes people kind of start exposing or expounding on their opinions without really clarifying what the presuppositions are. And I think that very much goes with what you're trying to say as well. Do we base our politics on some utopian abstraction, or do we actually base it on the reality, and let's say the reality of human nature? But this leads me to the next question, which would be, well, we live in a pluralistic context, if we want to or not. And I feel that liberalism really has triumphed with this ideal of personal and individual rights, personal individual freedom, that everything kind of comes down to that monad, right, to that individual and subject within society. So how in that society can we even agree on, let's say, the common good, something that for ancient thinkers was something, given almost. How can we agree on that? How if we have almost like diametrically opposed positions in politics, and even just in our lifestyle, or even in the understanding of what the meaning of life is? So how do you tackle that?
Right. That of course is an essential question, maybe the essential question in the modern context. Liberalism just seems like the common sense response to the problem of a kind of a pluralism. But there would be a lot to say in response to that. But maybe just an initial point is that it seems like the best one can do in given circumstances is at least carve out space for the individual. But one of the things that I think is helpful to realize in responding to the principles that are articulated there, I think it's helpful to realize, and this is something that has become, I think, especially clear in the last 10 years, 20 years, very recently, and that is that it's an illusion. The idea that somehow we have actually protected the individual agent and individual rights and individual kind of freedom of the individual. One can make an argument that we've never been there's never been as much conformism as now, or a kind of totalitarian vision. There are so many forces in operation that in subtle ways, you think of the market, you think of social media, you think of surveillance capitalism, you think of, one could go on and see that the promise of liberalism has failed. It actually has not delivered what it has promised. And that's, I think there's an increasingly general consensus in that regard. So then the question then becomes, well, what do we do? And the problem is precisely because we've lived so long without the guiding principles of a robust tradition. When the tradition of liberalism, because it too is a tradition that we've inherited, that we conform to and so forth, it's just as traditional as anything else, and it's just as sort of a priori given as anything else. We've lived so long in that context that when the failures of liberalism are coming to light, there is a tendency that one sees all over these days to react in a very violent way. So a resurgence of some of the most extreme versions of kind of reactionary politics that one can imagine, and both sides, I think, need the same, require the same response, the same solution, which is a calm, peaceful recovery of the tradition, in fact, in which we're all rooted. The whole the pluralism is a late development, and it's branches of a single tradition, and that there really is. We can exaggerate what pluralism means. I think that with a certain historical seriousness, we can see that there actually is a given tradition at the root of all this, and to my mind, it's precisely that that will enable us to fulfill the things that liberalism promised and didn't deliver on, which is the dignity of the individual, a kind of genuine freedom, integrity of the family, of the cultural space, and so forth. These things can be better safeguarded, I think, from a more from a politics of the real, or a political thought that's grounded in the given tradition that we've inherited.
One of the things that you mentioned is this idea of freedom, and you've dedicated multiple books on the subject. Actually, one that is on my bookshelf is The Freedom from Reality. And I'm going to very poorly summarize this, but well, I'm actually not going to summarize it, but what you can do that much better than I can. But what I realized is so this understanding of freedom, what freedom is for the individual and what my freedom is, when one is challenged, and this goes very much back to what you said, that, well, liberalism is a tradition, and we all live in a tradition if we want to or not, as much as we want to be, the apex of history or the best society that ever has existed. We all link back to traditions that have existed and were prior to us, and that, in fact, we are building on, if we want to or not, right? Nolens volens. And I've realized with students, when you challenge them on defining what the freedom is that they really want, that they really aspire to, oftentimes, if you just ask two more follow-up questions, they come into kind of this awkward position of embarrassment, where they realize, well, they may not be as free as they thought they were, right? Not as free as, I don't know, the media or even their peers tell them that they actually are. And they realize, wait a second, like, I am being manipulated in multiple ways, right? I'm being manipulated by politicians. I'm being manipulated by certain interest groups. And once they start thinking about it, they realize it. But I mean, I'm in a setting where you ask these questions in an academic philosophical context. Most people will actually never ask these questions, or will never encounter somebody that will ask a question. So they live in that, in this kind of artificial world of their.
It is, yeah. I mean, that's the concept of freedom from reality. The notion of freedom that we've inherited identifies freedom with a separation from prior claims, things to which we're bound. So the idea is the fewer bonds that we have, the freer we become. And in fact, I mean, that can be criticized in from a number of different perspectives. But one basic idea is that the more detached we become, the more we can't help but, to use the image, just drift along the current of the river. I mean, in a way, we have absolutely nothing to protect us from being simply driven by external forces of various sorts: economic, political, psychological, and so forth. We actually discover that we can stand more firmly on our own 2 feet the more profoundly we are bound to things that are genuinely true, good, and beautiful. So it's not bonds themselves that limit freedom, but bonds that we can't help but have, that are connected to things that are not good for our humanity. The bonds that are rooted in things that are real actually enhance freedom, and that transforms things completely. But it requires a real sort of conversion of horizons, given this sort of liberal anthropology that we can't help but live in. I find, for instance, it's kind of interesting with students, when I would start talking about these things, they would, it would resonate to a certain extent. But when I would ask them, to define freedom, it would often be, some form of freedom as being able to do what you want without limitations. And I actually think that there's more truth to that. I don't actually reject that. To me, it's a question of getting clearer about what it is that we want. But when I ask the students whether they choose what they want, whether their desires are actually objects of choice, functions of choice, that's where things get really awkward for them, because suddenly it's they want to say yes, but it becomes so obvious that there's an infinite regress problem once you set on that road, and it I think makes very clear that this absolutizing freedom as the power to choose indifferently among options is problematic, ghostly eventually.
Yeah. Well, it's freedom only remains free, or the free individual only remains free if he continually puts himself in a situation where he can keep choosing, right? And this is, again, I mean, for a Catholic, it's very easy to understand. It is sin that enslaves. So once we chose sin, then we put ourselves in a situation where we're not free anymore. We can get out of it with divine help and with God's grace, but ultimately we set up a framework in which we're not free anymore. So I can see why you would not reject, the student saying, well, I want to be free, not free from, but free to do something. Yeah. But then immediately, as you said, the follow-up would be, okay, but how do you choose what then to do, right? So very nice.
Yeah, Plato is extremely helpful with that question. I mean, that's the heart of so many of his paths of inquiry come down to this. What is it, in fact, that you want?
Yeah.
Which becomes the question, what is the good? Inevitably, what is the good?
Yeah. Well, you have a very interesting formulation, if we can just remain here with the good, and I really like it, and I would like you to comment on it. You said that the common good can be understood as a way of being, a paradoxical way of being, and that's what's striking. Why is it paradoxical? A paradoxical unity of giving and receiving. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah. It's interesting that was something that I wrote many years ago. Before, I used to have no interest whatsoever in political questions. I was all metaphysics and anthropology, and then I until I realized that you can't do that without a political context, and politics actually requires reflection on the meaning of being and the meaning of human being and so forth, that these are inseparable. But early on, I was asked to write something on the common good, and I drew on a theological tradition, Dionysius, the sort of Neoplatonic Christian Neoplatonism, Dionysius the Areopagite, and that has such a profound sense of eros and agape, receiving and giving being tightly bound together. And my question was, how can that illuminate the political question? And the point for me there was and still is in a kind of a way that's evolved a bit, is recognizing that the good is not simply an object that we pursue from the outside. It's not just a thing out there that we all are seeking. It's rather that's one dimension of it, but it's something that we internalize. It actually when we talk about the common good, we're talking about the meaning of community simply in the way that we are with each other. We're not simply enumerating the particular discrete things that we pursue together, and that deepening sense of interiorizing the common good sets into relief this further dimension about one can only in fact possess the good insofar as it transforms one into being good, and that finds expression in our generosity, in our doing good. And so the question of the common good ultimately turns on formation of character, virtue, these sort of classical dimensions of political thought.
Yeah, very good. Well, this is something where I think it becomes problematic, because here we come and I want to more talk about this problem of integralism and liberalism, but maybe since we are already here at the soul formation and at the kind of the Platonic idea, and maybe we can remain here for a minute, because if we want the state, the polis, have some kind of role in the formation of souls, then I think that is, the kind of classical and even very Christian understanding of the state. But what if the state is actually not acting in vision of, let's say, the transcendent good, but actually based on some kind of ideology. And I mean, this is where then, right, the totalitarian temptation comes in, where the state just, imposes its own vision of what your life and what you ought to be like and what you ought to do onto you. And that's, I feel, then the Christian would say, well, no, hold on a second. This is where the limit, this is the limit where the state breaches its function. So how do you come to terms with this problem? On the one hand, the Christian and the conservative wants the state to have some kind of input in soul formation, right, in the Platonic sense. On the other hand, where are the limits? So how can we work that out?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that needs to be said is that the state and the political authority, in a certain respect, and this is something that I think really warrants significant meditation and reflection. Is it's becoming increasingly clear to me that the state cannot but form the soul of citizens. So it's not a question of whether it chooses to or doesn't, whether it adopts policies, but there's a certain sense in which the state can't help but do it, and will either do it poorly or it will do it well. And part of the argument behind that is this really striking formulation that Aquinas offers in the beginning, the sort of prelude of his commentary on Aristotle's Politics. He defines the political good as the highest good to the highest degree. The political good is the highest human good, and the Latin that he uses, it's interesting. Can be translated as it's the root of our word conjecture. The political authority actually. One way to translate it is to say the political authority can't help but be an interpretation of what the highest human good is. It precisely as being the organizing principle of society. If you're going to organize society, you can't possibly do that except in view of what a human being is. So, nolens volens, as you say, the political authority will be an interpretation of the highest human good. Now, that means that if it shirks the responsibility for truth, goodness, and beauty, it will simply form us in the idea that those are not what defines human nature. And in fact, I think that's what we have. We have souls that have been formed in this vision that those things are subjective and they're not fundamental to human existence. So it's inevitable. Now, that doesn't mean that we should give free license to the state. I'm not, that have policies of enforced instruction and so forth. I think the practical question, the prudential question, is a major. It needs to be taken with a great amount of caution and seriousness and reflection. Policies are have to be introduced slowly, but the point is that one's sense of how to proceed changes if one recognizes that one has a responsibility to the truth. Mm-hmm. And not only for formation, but to the truth, and that will affect the way one then naturally forms souls. I hope there was a lot there, but
it is. No, it is. But I mean, this is an ongoing question, I think. But what comes out to me from what you're saying is this beautiful relation of the individual and the state. Again, as you say, that we cannot really get rid of it, but that is also in a sense circular, right? So the individual, by choosing what's the highest good in their life. So maybe they live a life of hedonism and it's just pleasure. It's just having the most pleasure at their disposal most of the time, or something like that. It immediately it influences, it changes their political behavior in the sense that it changes their behavior in their group, in their society, but then also in their voting, right? So right. I'm going to vote for a party that, I don't know, lifts the restriction on pornography, let's say. But then also that the political coterie that actually arranges itself around those false ideals then form the society, right? So it's this interplay between the individual and society that I think that's what I hear when you talk about right politics and the real. It's that it's not this utopian abstraction, but it's the real life decisions in my life that then affect the polis, and then the polis in turn affects me as an individual.
Yeah. And Plato put it in one line, or actually, this is a one-line summary of Plato's point that's kind of famous, and that is that the city is the soul writ large.
Yeah.
That in a way, the character of the city imprints itself on the character of the individuals who constitute the city, and the character of the individuals in the city influence the character of the city. So that there's, when he talks about the different political regimes, he talks about them as types of souls, like a general way of being, and not simply a pragmatic ordering of power or something.
Yeah, fascinating. One of the strongest elements of your book to me, okay, and I must confess this, that's the first chapter that I read. Okay, I skipped 5 chapters. I read immediately chapter 6, but I really thought this was gold, and I brought it also into my class, and I want to ask you about this. So, as it seems to me, and this is very much abbreviated, and as you, I was mostly interested, and I am still most interested in metaphysical questions, but I kind of do the political side as a necessary evil. But I'm now developing a liking towards it, which I guess is a good thing, I hope.
Yes,
in your case, it went into 2 good directions, so I'm hoping that I'm following good example here. But is the Catholic position on the political, let's say, schools of thought. And so what has happened, what you outlined in the book, and I think this is very much the background on which we're working on, the framework, is the church has seen and still sees the positive elements of, let's say, classical liberalism, right? The value of the individual corresponds to the value of the individual soul in church doctrine. The freedom that we spoke about, right? The freedom too corresponds to the Christian anthropological vision of what man is, and so forth. So there's a lot of good in that liberalism. Now there have been thinkers, and I think you deal mainly with Maritain, but also others, who have tried to emphasize and really come as close as they can within the Catholic context, in a friendly way, to that liberalism. So they're trying to not selling out, but trying to see the ideals and try to find and also match them with the Catholic understanding. So that on one side is liberalism. Now, then not everybody is in tune with this. And in fact, the other side, there's a new resurgence of a new school of political thought, which to me seems more like a neo-Augustinianism, but be it as it may, they call themselves Integralism, not to be confused with the French integralism, which is a little bit different. So the Waldstein integralism that sees the secular and the sacred separate, distinct, but also in a hierarchical order. And the sacred obviously is a higher order than the secular, and thus society must be structured. I hope I summarized this more or less well. Now, you want to tread a middle ground, and right. I want to hear all about that. Yeah. So, how do you manage that?
Yeah. Well, so on the one side, I mean, maybe a kind of a simple way of characterizing. On one side, liberalism wants to have a purely secular politics and leave the theological question to sort of private. Make it a purely private matter, but have no real place in the political sphere, and that's a self-enclosed secular sphere that one can be. It can be described in a variety of ways. Now, integralism says, well, that doesn't do justice to human nature because we're human beings are naturally meant for God and so forth, and so this theological dimension is necessary. So. A slight caricature, but I think that there's some profound truth to this. Integralism tends then to say, well, the theological needs to be layered on top, added to from the outside. So we have the secular political sphere, but then the church needs to show a kind of political force, recover a certain political force on top of that, and be the sort of supreme ordering principle of the political order. Now, I have a lot of sympathy with the idea that the church needs to recover a kind of political dimension. I think there's a profound insight that was lost in this negotiating with liberalism that happened in the 20th century. But it seems to me that this layering on top is a concession to modern politics that thinks that politics is all about power and who has the final say, who decides, as Carl Schmitt. I mean, the integralists are often quite favorable to Carl Schmitt's notion of authority and power. And what I want to suggest is that one of the truths of liberalism is this idea that the political ordering has an integrity of its own. And to put it in a kind of a simple formulation, what I would propose is that the church is not directly a political agent, but ought to influence indirectly, have an indirect influence. And so that part of it is not entirely new. There's a long tradition of that, but it seems to me this is the twist. If one has a proper understanding of the relationship between nature and grace, and that's a whole issue unto itself, it seems to me one could recognize that the church influences indirectly, but the indirect influence concerns the very essence of political life. So it's indirect, but it enters, you might say, from the inside of the political form. And that's an abstract formulation, but one of the things that means is that the first step is that we are called to recover the full meaning of politics and remove it from this purely pragmatic context, and recognize that politics is about the whole human being, about the good, the true, and the beautiful, about the real. And then we come to see that those things can't be understood except within a theological context. But that sort of middle step is really crucial. We don't go immediately to the theological. We go to the human, the centrally human, and that opens up naturally to the theological dimension.
Would that, I mean, could you give then a very practical counsel for, let's say, a voter, right, who has to decide that they live in a kind of multi-party democracy, or at least democracy. They have to decide between different parties, between different candidates. So, and what would that actually translate to then in the vote, in that moment of making the decision? So does that translate, or is it just like a general way of being in the political sphere?
Well, it doesn't. I don't think that one can just lay out a set of rules. I mean, that's one of the things that's really crucial when you think of politics, when you recover the centrality of the real. It also means prudence takes a central place. That the particularity of particular historical circumstances and geographical circumstances and demographics, all of those things are absolutely crucial as a context for any political decision. So it's the ideology that lays out a set of principles that can be applied in a kind of univocal way in any circumstance. But I think a genuine perspective is one that takes its bearings from truth in its ultimate sense, but those bearings that it takes illuminates the particularity of circumstances that have to be responded to in a concrete way. So, in other words, this to take like a concrete example, you're faced with a series of candidates. This idea that we need to recover a deeper sense of the significance of the theological in political matters doesn't mean that the candidate who talks about his faith most is the best candidate. Like automatically vote for the person who talks about God. I mean, you want to vote for the candidate who's the best politician, who actually has the most robust sense of human life and has a practical wisdom of how to orient it, I mean, that would have a certain priority.
That is so difficult, right? That
Oh,
judgment is so difficult to make.
it
Uh,
is.
I mean, it's you put it very beautifully, but it's so in the concrete. That's very difficult because one has to see through a lot of fakeness, or even some kind of just rhetoric, right, of the
I mean,
individual to figure out.
yeah.
And oftentimes one only knows how the politician ends up being after they are in office, after it's, so to speak, too late to make a change. So,
I mean,
but
that's actually, I mean, concretely speaking, it's very interesting. The politics of the real is an ethos and has sort of a cultural dimension, and one of the dimensions is a critique of things like technology driven
mhm,
social life, and that the reason that that's relevant here is it seems to me that the kind of superficiality and pure appearance and falsehood and so forth, those dangers are exaggerated in a culture that lives through artificial media in a way that the world has never really seen before. I mean, I think we're especially vulnerable to these problems. Um, so that's why, I mean, the response to these things that we're talking about requires such a fundamental change in everything that it can get really overwhelming. and
then
and that,
where to
yeah.
start though?
Yeah, right. Well, and the thing is, where to start is again, prudence. You start with yourself. You start with your household. You start with your community. You start with your neighbors. You start with your work. So it's very practical.
Clean your room, right?
Yeah, that's
That's
right.
what Jordan Peterson would say. Clean your room.
Make your bed. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, there's actually a really profound truth. One of the reasons he's resonated with so many people is
Yeah.
that there's a practical wisdom there that's onto something,
Yeah.
as we say.
Absolutely. Now, within this context, I just want to perseverate on one more, let's say, golden idol of the of liberalism, which is religious liberty. And so, a question was brought to me by one of the readers of your books, who was aware of the conversation that your father had with George Weigel, but maybe you also were involved in, at least in behind the scenes. And so I want to bring that question to you and see how you would respond. So the question is within the problem of religious liberty. So the church, the Second Vatican Council's teaching on religious liberty and what that actually trickles down to be. How do you distinguish between religious plurality, which
Yeah,
is more descriptive, and
right.
religious pluralism, which is more normative? So how do you bring those together?
Yeah, I mean, that's an important distinction to make, and it seems to me that from within the horizon of a liberal political order, we can't make a distinction between those two. We make the descriptive normative. We think
Mhm.
that pluralism, diversity, is unequivocally a good without sort of any discrimination whatsoever, and that means that the diversity of religions is somehow good. And it's funny that that's almost spontaneous and natural to people living in a contemporary context to think that promoting diversity of religion. The problem is that, again, it's an illusion, that there's an idea that you think the only alternative to that is an authoritarian, we say, religion that would coercively impose itself over and above everything else. First of all, we live in a regime that's doing that already. It's just religion of a certain type. It's a kind of generic, but it's monolithic in ways that would be hard to conceive.
Like Rousseau's civil religion.
Yeah, I mean, that's in fact, so that's in fact what we have. To my mind, what we need to do is we can't get around giving priority to a religious tradition. That's just
Mhm.
not possible, in fact. and the thought that we can do it turns out to be, as I've suggested many times, just an illusion. If that's the case, then we need to, one of the ways of approaching the problem is to suggest that religion tradition is best, which can best account for and accommodate the historical circumstances, the sort of descriptive dimension of religious pluralism. Mm-hmm. So what religious vision actually is able to give respect to the kind of religious seeking that one finds outside of that tradition? And I would so do you see how it's a very different way of thinking about the problem? Mm-hmm. This actually takes its stand in a distinct tradition, and then opens up to the question of diversity from within that stand. The other assumes that you can take this neutral stand, which ends up becoming a kind of monolithic horizon that's imposed on all of them, and that betrays itself in all sorts of just really destructive ways. I mean, you end up not having any religion at all, except in this, Rousseauan form of deifying political power, basically, mm-hmm. of different iterations.
And the will, yeah. No, beautifully said. I have one of your smaller books in my hand here. So this is God in the City. And you start this book off with a question that you tackle. I think you take it from Balthasar. But I want to throw that question back at you and see what you say. So as a kind of a closing question here, how does God enter politics?
That actually it was inspired by Heidegger.
Right. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
I got the footnote wrong here.
Yeah, and to think of that question in the political. So, how does God enter politics? I would say, any time there are two or three gathered in my name, I am there, present in them. I think that's a universally true statement that anytime human community is always naturally religious. Whenever you have human beings together, there's always naturally a kind of religious dimension to that. And the ancient world recognized that by conceiving the political community as having a sort of sacred character. I mean, so much so that, one of the greatest blasphemies possible was to leap over the wall of the city, and punishable by death. That it was sort of it's blasphemy. I mean, that's an interesting way to think about it.
Right.
Some people think that Christianity removed the sacredness of political community. I don't think that that's possible. I think, historically speaking, that was only true in the modern world. That wasn't true in the classical Christian tradition. And I don't think it's even true in the modern world, because we end up deifying precisely what we don't recognize as sacred. So God is always already there as part of human community. And the only choice we have is whether we do proper justice to that fact, or we pervert it through various ideological projections and illusions. And I know which way I would want to go, given the alternatives, and which way I think is healthier and more promising for human flourishing.
Yeah. Well, that in itself is also just an argument for the natural religiosity of the human being, right? That whenever he thinks he has finally overcome religion, has finally abolished religion, what happens is that it just kind of sneaks in again. I think, was it René Girard who said that myth does not vanish, it's just replaced with another myth. Now, in this case, it's not religion, not as a myth, but religion as the sacred yearning of the individual that will be somewhere in his life. So now we're going right back to the beginning, where we go discerning what the goods are that we actually want to strive for, and then how that imprints on society, right? So.
Yeah, and this is Augustine's critique of idolatry. One either recognizes God or an idol, a substitute for God. But we can't help, as human beings, desire God in some fundamental way. And that means we can't, as a community, we can't help but worship God publicly in some way. That's inevitable.
Well said. Well, David, thank you so much for your time. And I hope that you keep on investigating these subjects and write beautifully written books on them, which are not just a pleasure to apprehend, but also a pleasure to read. So thank you very much for your time today. And then I hope that I'll have you back on the show and we can have another reality check.
Sure.
Very
Thank
good.
you.